I never really thought leaves could start a war. But looking back, that's exactly how it all began. It began with what felt like a small annoyance, something I brushed off at first, but then just kept happening over and over. See, my neighbor, let's call him Mr. Johnson, had this big loud leaf blower. Every weekend, like clockwork, he'd fire it up, and I swear the leaves would end up all over my yard. Not just a stray one or two either. I'm talking piles scattered around like they were purposefully sent my way. At first, I thought maybe it was just the wind or something. You know how leaf blowers create this big cloud of leaves and dust? I figured some of it was inevitable. So I ignored it for a while, hoping it would just blow over, pun intended. But then it kept happening. Every Saturday morning, leaves from his yard would be dumped right onto mine. The thing is, I take pride in my yard. I keep it neat, mowed grass, trimmed bushes, and every season I rake to keep it clean. It was frustrating to see that effort undone repeatedly without even realizing anybody was being careless. One morning, after the usual leaf invasion had trashed my freshly cleaned lawn, I decided to do something about it. I went over to his porch when he took a break and politely said, "Hey, Mr. Johnson, I don't know if you realize, but when you use your leaf blower, a lot of the leaves are ending up on my yard. It's been happening for a while, and it's kind of a pain since I just cleaned up last weekend." I was careful not to sound accusatory, maybe even a little understanding, figuring he just didn't notice. He looked at me like I was ridiculous. "Huh," he said. "Those leaves come from your tree too, doesn't matter where they land." He shrugged and went back to blowing his yard. That was the moment I realized I was dealing with more than just falling leaves. I was dealing with a neighbor who just didn't care. I wanted to believe it was an honest mistake, but the indifference in his tone told me otherwise. Every time I brought it up quietly, it just got ignored or brushed off like I was the one being annoying. After a few more weekends of the same thing, my yard getting decorated with his leaves like some unwanted gift, I reached my limit. There was an easy courtesy, a basic respect to neighbors that I was hoping for, but it simply wasn't there. Honestly, it started to feel like he thought he could just steamroll over my space because I hadn't made a big deal. At that point, I remember standing in my yard, staring at the messy chaos of leaves and thinking, you know what? I'm done letting this go. It wasn't just about leaves anymore. It was about respect and boundaries. I couldn't just wait for him to change or hope this would magically stop. Something had to be done, and I had to be the one to do it. So that's when the idea started forming in my head. Maybe if the leaves kept coming into my yard, I could find a way to return the favor. Not in some childish tantrum, but in a way that would make him realize, clear as day, that his careless actions had consequences. I wanted to send a message loud and clear. This is my yard and it deserves respect. But first, I had to be sure that whatever I did wouldn't just escalate into a full-on feud or backfire on me. I needed a plan. A way to take back my yard without feeling like I was stooping to his level. The funny thing about those endless leaves was that they didn't just pile up on my lawn. They piled up in my mind too, like a growing urge to reclaim what was rightfully mine. And so, fueled by days of frustration and that dull ache of being dismissed, I started thinking about my next move. What came next wasn't just about leaves anymore, it was about making a statement. Looking back, little did I know those scattered leaves were really the first shots fired in what came to be my own little leaf war. Alright, so after a few weeks of steady leaf invasions, I realized that just grumbling or passively blowing them back wouldn't cut it. Honestly, at first I thought maybe it was just a lazy neighbor, or someone who didn't realize how much of their yard was drifting into mine. But when the pile kept growing, big enough to crunch under my boots, and I found leaves piled up in corners of my yard where no wind could possibly carry them from anywhere else, it hit me. This was a subtle kind of disrespect, and I wasn't about to just accept that. Now I could have gone old school and just shoved the leaves back across the fence with the leaf blower, but that felt way too impulsive. And honestly kind of petty. I wanted to do something smarter, something creative that would get the message across without causing a full-blown neighborhood war. So I spent a few days really thinking it through, watching how the wind carried the leaves, and carefully raking up every last one that showed up. No leaf left behind. I even dragged out my tarp and bit by bit collected these piles, making sure not to miss a single one. The more I raked, the more I started to see the scale of it. It wasn't just a few harmless leaves anymore. It was a steady wave of their yard creeping into mine. And it felt like a violation of my space, a crossing of unspoken lines. I wasn't angry in a blind way, but I was definitely feeling the need to take back control. That meant no half measures. That evening, after the sun had gone down and the neighborhood had quieted, I laid out my plan in my head. Instead of scattering leaves carelessly, I'd return them in an unmistakably intentional way, poised to make a point without saying a word. I decided I'd neatly arrange every leaf pile right at the exact spot where the neighbor's yard and mine met, right along the fence line. No messy piles to dismiss as wind-blown debris. No drifting leaves that you could just brush off as accidental. I wanted it to be clear. These leaves came directly from their yard, and they belonged there. And yeah, I knew this was a little bit of a power move. But after weeks of waking up to my garden looking like a leafy quarantine zone, I figured a message like this was well overdue. It was about respect and boundaries, simple stuff really. And if my neighbor couldn't respect those, I'd just make sure it was impossible for them to miss the point. So I set up my tarp, carefully raked all the leaves into tidy stacks, and lined them up along the property line. I wasn't doing this out of malice or trying to start a fight. I just wanted them to see what it looked like when leaf invasions were returned in full force and with intention. No sudden blasts from a leaf blower, no dramatic shouting from across the fence, just quiet, deliberate, unmistakable piles that said, "Hey, these are your leaves and you need to take care of your side." At that moment, resting my rake against the fence and stepping back to admire what looked like a border of bright orange and red leaves, I felt a little victorious. I'd taken control of the situation in a way that was smart and firm without being reckless. But I also knew that this was just the beginning. With my plan in place, I got ready to execute my response and send a clear message about respecting property boundaries. So, after days of those stubborn leaves drifting over my fence like they owned the place, I finally decided enough was enough. I remember waking up one Saturday morning with this weird mix of determination and amusement, like I was about to do something petty, but also downright satisfying. The air was crisp, the sky was that pale blue that promised a perfect fall day. And there was an entire yard on the other side of that fence that needed a little reminder. I grabbed my rake in those giant garbage bags, one strong enough to hold a small mountain of leaves, then stepped into the backyard. My plan wasn't just to dump the leaves back haphazardly, no way. I wanted it to be clear. I cared enough to put in the effort, and so should my neighbor. This wasn't about making a mess. It was about making a statement. I started by gathering every scattered leaf that had flown in over the last few weeks. It took a while, more than I expected. I bent over again and again, sweeping through the grass in smooth arcs, trying not to miss a single leaf. It felt like picking up after someone who wasn't even sorry for leaving a mess. But as tedious as it was, I found myself oddly focused, almost methodical. When I filled a bag, I'd tie it up tight and drag it to the side gate that separated our yards. No shortcuts here. Once I had all those bags piled up, it was time to go over the fence. I don't know what I thought it'd be like, but maybe there'd be some moment of confrontation or drama. Instead, it was just me, carefully carrying the bags across the cracked wooden fence panel that served as our boundary. I could almost hear the silent message in each step. "This is yours now. Please take care of it." Then came the real art of it. I didn't just toss the leaves on their lawn like a dump truck. I took my time and made neat little piles in several spots, almost like I was landscaping. I pushed those leaves into tidy mounds, each one distinct, showing that I wasn't just angry. I was precise. It was like saying, "See? I put in the effort to stack these just so. I'm not wasting my energy here. I'm setting a boundary." As I worked, I caught myself glancing at the neighbor's house, waiting for some reaction through the windows. But the place was quiet. Maybe they were around and just choosing ignorance, or maybe this was the moment they'd finally start to understand that their carelessness wasn't going unnoticed. Either way, the silent yard made the piles of leaves even louder. By the time I stepped back and looked at everything, there was a strange sense of accomplishment mixed with relief. I'd taken all these little pieces of their neglect and returned them in a way that couldn't be mistaken. It felt like I'd finally claimed a small victory. Not with anger or yelling, but with quiet persistence. Standing there, watching those neat leaf piles flutter softly in the breeze, it hit me how much satisfaction there is in standing up for yourself, even over something as simple as fallen leaves. Sometimes those small battles we fight around the edges of our lives matter more than we think. Beyond just sending a message to my neighbor, I'd reminded myself that respecting boundaries is worth the trouble. And with that thought settled in, I turned to head back inside, curious to see how long it would take before the leaves, or something else, crossed that line again. You know, standing your ground isn't always about loud arguments or dramatic showdowns. After all the back and forth with my neighbor and the endless parade of leaves blowing into my yard, it finally hit me. I didn't have to stoop to confrontation or passive-aggressive notes. Instead, I could handle this in a way that was clever, calm, and most importantly, made it clear I wasn't someone to be walked over. First, I was just annoyed like anyone would be. But as it dragged on, I started feeling something else. This weird mix of frustration and empowerment. It was frustrating because every time I bent over and raked my yard clean for the 100th time, the leaves just kept coming back like clockwork. But there was this growing sense inside me, a desire not to be treated like some doormat. I kept thinking, if I let this slide, what else will they think they can get away with? That's when the shift happened. Instead of fuming silently or exploding in anger, I decided to set a boundary. Not with words but with action. I began collecting the leaves, sure, but then carefully, deliberately returning them. Not in a messy, chaotic pile, but rather neatly bagged and placed right along the invisible line between our properties. Each bag was a statement. This stops here. This is my space. Doing that, day after day, felt strangely empowering. Every time I walked outside and saw those neat little piles waiting on their side, I felt like I was telling my own story. One about respect, about knowing my worth, about not allowing someone else's carelessness to just be brushed aside. It wasn't even about getting in a fight anymore. It was about reclaiming my peace of mind. Weirdly enough, it felt like a conversation without words, my way of saying, hey, I'm here, and I deserve to have my boundaries honored. And I didn't have to raise my voice for anyone to hear it. That kind of quiet confidence, that calm insistence on respect, it taught me a lot about how far subtlety can go. Looking back, I realize how easy it is to let things slide, especially when the person causing the problem is close by or someone you see all the time. We often hope it's easier to just ignore the little annoyances, to keep the peace at the cost of our own comfort. But the truth is that peace? It becomes fragile when you don't assert your limits. When you give people the tiniest inch, they often want miles. The leaves were a small thing, sure, but they were my way in. My way of saying, you can't just cross over and dump your mess here. And standing up for myself in that quiet, patient way made me proud. It was more than just about leaves. It was about realizing that respect starts with boundaries, and those boundaries can be drawn without shouting, without bitterness, just by being firm and thoughtful. So yeah, sometimes the best kind of revenge isn't about getting even in some flashy or angry way. Sometimes the best revenge is simply asserting yourself and making sure your boundaries are known. And trust me, that lesson, it's one that sticks with you long after the last leaf has blown away.